Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Thursday morning webinar series. My name is Chloe Tetro. I am the health coach here with ReadyCare. For this morning's talk, what we're going to be looking at is conflict. So that is external conflict and internal conflict through the lens of conflict management and psychotherapeutic fields to basically look at shifting the perspective around conflict, be it in a workplace setting or home place setting, but also applying some of the content we'll be chatting about to basically look at the internal conflicts. And why I bring this up within the sphere of lifestyle management is oftentimes when people undertake dietary changes, lifestyle changes, you may be familiar with a part of you wants to do it, and a secondary part is in conflict with that desire. And that's the type of language that we tend to use when I chat to people in client-based one-to-one sessions. It can often come up that, they'll use language like, I have a tendency to self-sabotage, or I know what I should be doing, but there's that internal clash happening. And we use this type of imagery because that's essentially what's happening is two things want different things, and that's getting in the way of the intention and task at the end of the goal. So what we talk about today can be applicable both externally within your own life with conflict management, but it can also be applied internally. So without further ado, so for today, it'll be basically the conflict as the birthplace of harmony, which is an odd thing to think about. But essentially, when we think of conflict as something, we can think of it as something to avoid, right? It's a clash of wills, it's an argument, it's a breakdown in communication. But with conflict, oftentimes it's less a failure of harmony and more oftentimes a place where emergence can start to happen. And I mean that internally and externally as well. So opposites aren't just clashes, they can be that spark for something new. And oftentimes, if you think about it in terms of, if you're coming up with projects, it's really good to have the opposite show itself as well. Whatever field of vision that we have, however we view the world, it's really enriching in creative projects where there's less of an emotional drive happening and less of a friction. We can see how beneficial it is to have an absolute opposite come in as well sometimes. So if we can approach those tensions as information, something greater can happen from it, essentially. So in psychology and systems theory, there we go. Hope you can see that. Hang on, I'll make it a little bit bigger. There we go. In psychology and systems theory, conflict, all that basically means, so I'll give a definition of terms before I go into it any further. It means when there's two needs or two values or two perceptions that are competing for expression, right? So it's not defined as a fight. It's not defined as an argument, right? Which I think is an interesting start point. It just means when there are two or more needs, values, or perceptions competing for expression. So something that's driving the conflict is oftentimes, what I mean by needs is whatever the person, or it could be, two parts of yourself, there's a necessity for things like safety, belonging, success, being seen as knowledgeable. And then another part or another person could be somebody who wants to keep the peace, right? That's their need. They need to keep the peace. Or it could be somebody who needs to rebel, feel like they have their own personal freedom. And this comes in hugely when there's that clash of, part of me wants to do something and part of me doesn't. The most common one that I see is the part that wants to do the task and the part that says, I don't know about this. I don't know about change. I don't know about somebody else telling me what to do, even if that somebody else is ourselves, right? And that sounds a bit funny, but where food changes particularly come in, when somebody's doing quite well and all of a sudden they go, I really don't feel like doing this. And they'll say, well, I do actually. Part of me really wants to do this, but the other part is allergic to the thought of having to do something applied externally onto themselves. And that's a super, super common one. Like, we all want freedom, we all want autonomy. Most of us don't really like being told what to do. So that's an example of when there's two needs or values or perceptions competing for that expression. So it doesn't have to be destructive. It's it's usually just a communication problem that hasn't yet found its form. So with the Harvard negotiation project, they found that about 65% of workplace conflict arose not just from, what we'd usually think of personality clashes, or they just don't get on, or they just don't see eye to eye, but it's more a misaligned perception and unmet needs. So two people that see the world very, very differently, and they both have very different needs. One might need to be seen as competent, right? And when I say the word need, I really mean that we can all pick out people from our lives that they need to be admired. They need to be seen as, people have to almost applaud them and say, wow, that was so intelligent, well done. And then other people might just have the needs of the team in mind, right? So that's a very common conflict that can come up in workplace, where somebody's personal needs can sometimes supersede the needs of a team or a community. That's very, very normal. So it's often more about these two worldviews that aren't really necessarily being heard, right? And we can often think that there's a right and a wrong, and that's a very oversimplified way of thinking about things. And oftentimes, I mean, if you think about a person that you've a lot of conflict with, the need to feel right can actually aggravate conflict. And when we bring it right back to, our person who wants to all of a sudden change their diet and change their lifestyle, if one part's always browbeating the other and saying, shut up, I'm the part that you listen to. So if somebody's like, we are going to do this, we are doing that, but they're constantly being met with friction, right? You have to start to listen to what that part says. Otherwise, it's always going to feel like a cog in the wheel where you can't quite get going. So that's a very, very important thing to put out there from the get-go. It is very important to see that there are two truths trying to coexist. So if we react defensively, we can polarize. So each side's pulling harder and harder and harder to assert its rightness. Now, if you've kids, it's easier to see why sometimes, being right and wrong isn't really the way to approach a conflict, but it's more about listening to both sides and helping them to see, look, part of you might be right, but sometimes two truths, very annoyingly, can coexist with each other. So if we pause, if we become curious and listen beneath the surface of things, conflict can become a really, really good teacher, right? It shows us where understanding isn't quite there yet. So inside ourselves, that process will play out as well. So one part, as I said, will crave that freedom. Another part will crave discipline or security. One might want to speak out and another one might fear exposure. So if you're going for a job, right, a different job, and you say, part of me really wants this, but the other part of me is constantly seeming to sabotage myself. And I feel like I've got this tug of war, right? That's another one I hear a lot imagery wise, tug of war or seesaw, where I really want to do this, but I'm so afraid of putting myself out there. And I feel like there's these two conflicting parts in non-dialogue with each other. So when we stop trying to silence one of the parts and stop listening to both, we move from opposition to what's called composition, right? That creates a much more larger, more integrated self. So putting that, next slide, I'm doing great with my slides today. So if you imagine conflict as a triangle, at the base of it, there's two opposing poles, right? There's your view and my view. If you're a team leader, you're probably aware of this playing out and how to manage it a little bit. Or if you're stepping into a leadership role, these things are really important to be aware of. So within yourself, that can be these two clashing parts, your need for autonomy versus the need for belonging, right? When we stay at the base, we're always going to pull against each other. It's that spectrum, it's the black and white. They're both convinced that one must win for the other to lose. But at the apex, right, so if you reach for a third position to create a triangle, there's a space for awareness where you can hold both perspectives, where the necessity for right and wrong and black and white and this or that starts to dilute away, and two things that seem in opposition can actually coexist with one another. So it's a huge perspective shift that invites that something new, right? A bird's eye view. Okay, if you're seeing both of these things, being able to say, for example, a good way in is to say, I can see both sides of the argument. I can see where they differ. Now let's look at where they intersect with one another. And there's Chase Hughes, that FBI, he used to be an FBI negotiator, right? And in mediation and negotiation, this is a big side of it, is you're not just looking at the force that clashes, you're looking at, okay, why are we both here? Are there things that we can meet in the middle and converge? Like a Venn diagram might be a better mental imagery here, where you have two things, but there is an intersection in the middle. So a synthesis of both of these things is a new idea that will transcend both sides of one argument. And if you have any questions, please do pop them in, by the way, because I don't want it to always just be me speaking at people. So if you do have, things that you've found that worked or anything like that, let me know. So in psychosynthesis, there's something called the reconciling third, and that's a very, very common. You'll see that over and over if you're in, a workplace or family space, where it's the high awareness that those two things can be in opposition, in tension, without collapsing, right? The whole thing doesn't have to become World War III. So when we step more into that bird's eye view, we create a triangle, conflict can become more creative, right? So I spoke about that kind of ball hopping creativity when you're in a boardroom where you're coming up with ideas. It can be that space where, yes, there's something very different from your viewpoint, but actually that can feed into, an intention that you have to grow something even better. So every external conflict will reflect something internal. I'm nearly done with this as well. And do know that you can pop in questions or comments or anything like that. So every external conflict will mirror something internal. If I'm triggered by somebody's stubbornness, for example, which of course I would be, because I'm very stubborn myself, it might be because I'm not looking at my own capacity for holding my own. And you've probably heard the old adage that whatever annoys us in something else is something we have to look at, right? So if somebody oh gosh, they think they own the place and this and that, and they always have something to say, they always have to be seen and blah blah blah. We can go into it going, yeah, I just don't like them, I think they need all eyes on them at all points. Or they could be reflecting that part that you say, God, part of me would love to be a bit like that, because it's so alien to me that somebody would be so confident that actually it makes me really uncomfortable. And that's a great mirror to say, and it's so painful, because the last person you want to learn any lessons from is somebody that you'd almost want to say, just give me a second with them in a ring and pow. But oftentimes the things that bring that kind of irritation, anger, I think the word triggered is a bit overwrought, but that thing that gives us a big feeling, basically, that we view in others, is oftentimes something that we need to integrate within ourselves. So in a system called IFS, right, it's basically internal family systems. It's a very popular therapeutic analysis of all of these conflicting parts, what I'm speaking about here today. So we can project things we don't like about ourselves or haven't paid attention to onto other people, and we reject in others what we can't make peace with in ourselves. This is so, so common. If you try to find an example of somebody that drives sweat out through you, do they have attributes that, they might be that might be over highlighted in their personality, that actually in yourself, you kind of go, I haven't paid a lot of attention to this in myself. Bossy people, sometimes people that are bossy, that drive sweat out through us, is because part of us would almost say, I'd love to have a little bit more of that in me. So turning inwards with curiosity instead of judgment will change that, and that inner dialogue can begin to soften. The part of us that we're at war with can begin to collaborate. We can shift from who's right to remember what is needed. What are some of the values at play? What lens is this person or part viewing the world through that I'm not really seeing right now? So research supports this hugely. There's meta-analysis on emotional intelligence that found that leaders with high self-awareness are up to 60% more effective at resolving interpersonal conflict. So managers and leaders that are great at getting two people who could skin each other in the office and saying, look, what's happening there, lads, is because they've perfected that triangle. They've perfected the necessity to have who's right, who's wrong. And internal alignment would precede relational harmony. And what that means is if there's a little bit of being aware of both sides, what brings them together, including within ourselves, right? I'm giving an external example here within workplace that can be directly implicated for internal things. If you're somebody trying to make lifestyle behavior changes that constantly finds themselves around the language of, I have this conflict, part of me wants to tug of war, all these different things. It's the exact same process at play here with all of this. So honoring rather than repressing is a good takeaway from that. Now, in last little section, and I'll let you guys go for the morning rather than be listening to this all day long. So opposition in mediation theory, it's more about changing duality into dialogue. Now, it's a little bit of repetition in this because essentially books and talks and all these different things can get really, really into the detail of it. There's lots of fantastic resources online, but it is really as simple as the shift happens when we move from positions to interests, right? And what I mean by that is a position is, I want X to happen. I want additional hours. To interests, right? I want to be recognized for my work. I want my work to be fairly looked at. I want it to be fairly compensated, right? So there's a very, very slight shift in I want X that's going to come up against the, there's no space for that, to interests. So that shift from positions to interests, things that you need. I need recognition. I need fairness. That already is a whole different conversation, right? If you go in with interests rather than that kind of hard and fast bullhorn of what I want is in direct opposition. Salespeople are brilliant at this, right? A salesperson that can sell ice to an Eskimo, they're not going to sell you a product that you say no to. They're going to find out what your problems are and how this can be resolved with what they're selling. So they're looking at what your personal interests are. They're looking at what makes you tick, what motivates you, and they're very, very cute in saying, okay, right, so I've listened to everything that you need. Remember, it's needs, values, and perception are the shifts away from clashing opposition thought processes. And once we know what those underlying needs are, we stop arguing about the surface and we start meeting at the level of what is shared, right? Same thing happens within ourselves. Behind every inner argument, there's a longing for these two parts to be seen, because unfortunately, which you've probably noticed, and I say this to people that will commonly say, I've tried this over and over and over and over and over again, and lots of people do, right? And we all do in different facets of our lives for different things. Is there a pattern that you can see where you try to do something that you know you want to do For me, it is always the same example. It's always going to be the gym, because I have to constantly work at this, even though this is my job and I've been in the field for 8 years. You have to find the parts that are clashing with what you want. And instead of going, ba la 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 la, they don't exist, and I'm going to just iron will myself through it, that does not work. They will find a way to trip you up. They will find a way to basically sabotage your efforts. So you have to give it a little bit of fully seeing what is happening. What I tend to do and what I do with clients is imagine them as two separate people. If they're internal conflicting parts, give them both a personality and hear them out, right? Hear what they're in conflict about and hear what they both need from the other, right? That's a very, very simple tool to make sure that both sides of your internal argument are being seen. So conflict isn't the end of connection. It can be the actual start of something bigger, better, particularly where I'm talking about that internal conflict. If you can finally resolve that tug of war within yourself by understanding that part of you doesn't like being told what to do. So they need at least a day that you can freestyle, right? There's no food plan, there's no this, there's no discipline. It's freestyle day. That part gets to go, look, I acknowledge that that's been a problem in the past. I acknowledge that I'm not cookie cutter trying to fish a square peg in a round hole, and I have to acknowledge who I am and what I need, right? That connection part will invite us to think beyond binaries and to a much higher way of approaching things, and start to do this out in your life, right? And start to notice and bring awareness to it. In your workplace, try to see who's really good at navigating clashes and what do they do? How do they employ language around it? So key takeaway here, lads, and I'll let you go for the day. Bam. Conflict is information problem most of the time. It's a miscommunication, not a who's right, who's wrong. Somebody's not hearing somebody else. And if they are hearing somebody else, they're letting that person's perspective make them feel like they will be crushed by it, right? So for somebody that's still in that right and wrong, black and white perspective, it basically means that there's no room, when somebody finds themselves in that clashing perspective, there's no room for two things to be right? And it's a really big trap for us to consistently think that if the other person is right, it means we're wrong. If the other person's way of thinking is the right one, that we stop fighting and we let them have, that it means that we're nothing, right? Our perception is wrong. Our reality is wrong. Our way of viewing, of thinking, of being is wrong. Because that's the trap we fall into. And that's why we fight double hard, is that we think subconsciously, if they're right, I'm wrong, right? And we want to get away from that. We want to acknowledge that two truths can coexist. And they're just seeking integration with each other. So two opposing needs often protect something valuable, right? If you're able to honor both, it's going to help hugely. And this is more when there's in workplace setting, family settings, global settings. That's basically, if you can find out, a simpler way to put it, if you can find out what's important to the other person that they're protecting really hard, you can find a way around that by allowing them to have that. So let's go back to the person that needs recognition. If you can see that they need recognition and you're clashing with them constantly, find a way that you can recognize their efforts that doesn't stop the progress of the rest of the team. Or, give them more review meetings, or thank them for the work that they've done ahead of it. Again, salespeople are very cute where these things are concerned. Knowing how another person views the world and what's important to them is absolutely vital to conflict resolution. And it makes us step out of our own little perceptive field of only me exists, me at the center of the universe. As I said, this is a lot more, we do this more naturally with kids. Some kids are really soft and gentle by nature, and for them, being kind might be really important, or, why did you yell at me? Whereas for another, chaos might be important, playfulness, that need to run around. And when we're in a position where we become the natural triangulation between two other people, kids, it's easier to do with, but it might be two other people in your life, siblings, right? Where you can say they're so different, and different things are important to the other. So as long as both are being met in there, it's going to help to resolve conflict a lot easier. Integration is much, much better than polarization. So finding the third or higher perspective, that apex of awareness, it's basically it's the same thing I'm saying here, lads. It's stepping away from one's right, one's wrong. If you had two siblings that were very different, you wouldn't say one's an absolute goat while the other's an absolute troll, right? You wouldn't think that. You'd say they're driven by very different ways of viewing the world. And for there to be a conflict, both of their needs and what's important to them has to be valued. So that awareness will really transform reactivity into creativity. Remember, somebody's going to get really reactive if by entering into conflict, they feel that if they don't win, who they are and what's important to them is rubbish and crushed and wrong, right? So that's me. That's my takeaway for the day. Hope you found some of that helpful. It's very difficult to pack a whole field into a short talk, but I hope you did find it helpful, and have a lovely rest of your day. And if you have any comments or questions, as always, I always love to receive them. Have a lovely time, and be on the lookout for people who are brilliant at managing conflict and see what they do, right? Mind yourself. Bye now.